And welcome to the Great American Mail. This is our weekly podcast. We do a podcast every week where we break down the news of the past week in reverse order. We may go a little bit out of order this evening because this is the first time that we're going to live stream it as well. Probably going to be doing that in the future. If you people join, please, if you want to comment, subscribe and comment, please do. And we'll try to get to those if we can. We'll see how it goes. So the biggest story of the week was, and by the way, if you can let me know on the audio, because this is a slightly different audio feed that we're used to doing here. So if the audio gets bad. So the biggest stories of the week last week by far were Joe Biden's State of the Union address and the Ukraine-Russia crisis. So let's get started with President Biden. He spoke at his State of the Union address, and in the lead up to it, we said that his State of the Union address would be full of sort of untruths and outright falsehoods, and it was. We also said, and we made a mistake on this one, we said that we didn't think he would last an hour. We didn't think he would last 30 minutes. We thought it would be a short State of the Union address. In fact, he lasted about an hour and 10 minutes. So to be fair to President Biden, he did, again, in terms of the delivery, it wasn't bad for him. Biden's never been a great deliverer in terms of his politics. He just isn't. And I thought he did a pretty good job in terms of the delivery. The actual words that he said were awful. And so let's just get a start for where he started. And this is one of the first things he had to say. President Biden at the State of the Union said this. Take a listen.
Let's use this moment to reset. So stop looking at COVID as a partisan dividing line. See it for what it is, a god-awful disease. Let's stop seeing each other as enemies and start seeing each other for who we are, fellow Americans. We have the tools to combat COVID-19.
Now, it's interesting when he said that, a lot of us were aghast, and I think the whole nation was aghast. I mean, they spent the last couple of years saying that we're, Nazis, and if you didn't agree with them, you had serious problems. And it was sort of galling for the president to all of a sudden say, let's not use this as a partisan mechanism. On the on the Twitter feed, we had done until recently, we're probably going to pick it back up, we had done a count of the COVID deaths. And the reason we had done that, because in the second debate, or maybe in the third debate, Biden said at that time there had been 200,000 deaths when President Trump was the president. And Biden said any person who is responsible for 200 deaths should no longer be the president. And it was just galling then that he would use COVID for political means at that point. And to hear him do it during the State of the Union address was galling. And so, of course, as the week went on, we looked to see if the country had moved on, because he wanted us to no longer use things like COVID to be partisan. So we looked and we checked, and it turns out, in fact, the January 6th defendants are still locked up. They're still not getting speedy trials. They're still not getting access to the information, all the video that they've had. They're still not getting access to bails and things of that nature. So it doesn't look like the party is moving on. It looks like Biden just did that to say something to try and quote unquote unify the people, but he didn't really mean it. Another thing that Biden said that we were sort of shocked by was this little doozy about wages. Take a listen to President Biden at the State of the Union address.
And so we have a choice. One way to fight inflation is to drive down wages and make Americans poorer. I think I have a better idea to fight inflation. Lower your costs, not your wages.
Now, it was interesting, this bit here. I mean, a lot of people use this as an opportunity to point out that, your biggest cost are wages, right? So a lot of people covered that ground. But what's going on here that's interesting is lower your costs, not your wages. I mean, the problem that Biden and a lot of the Democrats nowadays face is they seem to think that there's this idea that, in economics, you learn the concept of scarcity. So people understand that things go up depending on how scarce they are. But the better way to think about it in Thomas Sowell's book is a great book. Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson, is also almost as good. You have to think about economics as scarce resources that have alternative uses. So if Biden thinks you can just lower your costs, right, without accounting for wages, that just isn't going to work. Which is to say this: if you keep wages high, you're just going to draw people up to take those wages, and then people who have lost those people are going to have to pay higher wages. So a perfect example of that would be if the donut manufacturer raises their wage, and then the hamburger person comes over to work for the donut person, and then in response to that, the florist person raises their wages so that they can get the donut person. All that's going to do is just continue to raise wages. But ultimately, that's going to lead in inflation. Everybody's going to have to pay higher prices. Right. Anyway, but this is just Biden continuing to have sound bites, one-step thinking, so he can say something to the American public, and it doesn't have to really make any sense. We've talked about this time and time again on the daily podcast, which if you're interested, you can get the daily podcast anywhere you get podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, anywhere you get podcasts, Great American Mail, or you can put in Gamcast. Either way, it'll come up. So we do the daily podcast. This weekly podcast is something we do to wrap up the past week. So anyway, so Biden continued on this regard. He said one other thing that was interesting. What he's about to say is obviously a sap to the unions, but it's also something that's been contradicted by President Obama. But anyway, he continued. Take a listen.
Folks,
standing ovation for nothing.
that means make more cars and semiconductors in America. More infrastructure and innovation in America. More goods moving faster and cheaper in America. More jobs where you can earn a good living in America. Instead of relying on foreign supply chains, let's make it in America. And so we have
the problem that's going on there is that Biden has is that it's globalization. So this is the type of thing that might have worked back in the 50s. You could keep jobs in America, but you really can't do that anymore. And so the point you have to understand is scarce resources that have alternative uses. And so it's better for Americans to buy from people who can make things more cheaply than it is to make those things arbitrarily made here if they're going to be more expensive. And this is just not something you can control. A lot of the things that Democrats have been saying for the last week is that a lot of the inflation is because people are greedy. Well, if people are greedy and that's what's causing inflation, why weren't they greedy during the 4 years of Trump? Why weren't they greedy during the 8 years of Obama? He had no inflation, neither did Trump. I mean, did they all of a sudden just decide to become greedy? No. The fact of the matter is, this is a global economy, and you can no longer make T-shirts in America, for example, if you can make them in Southeast Asia for a fraction of the cost. And the other thing that they don't want to tell you about this, and this is really sad, is that these are only talking about manufacturing goods, right? We're talking about manufacturing jobs, right? But America has become a service economy. In large part, we've exported a lot of our manufacturing jobs, and Biden just seems to be living in the past. Now, part of the reason he wants to live in the past is that a lot of these manufacturing jobs are union jobs. And we all know unions tend to take their money and they donate it to Democrat causes. And then Democrat causes turn around and try to favor unions. And that this cycle has been going on for quite some time. But if you don't want to believe me, right, why don't you listen to Barack Obama himself, who had this to say about the attempt to keep manufacturing jobs in America at this day and age. Take a listen to President Obama.
And somebody says, like the person you just mentioned, who I'm not going to advertise for, that he's going to bring all these jobs back. Well, how exactly are you going to do that? What are you going to do? There's no answer to it. He just says, well, I'm going to negotiate a better deal. Well, how exactly are you going to negotiate that? What magic wand do you have? And usually the answer is he doesn't have an answer.
And so Obama said that, and he was right when he said it. And that's just the fact. Is a lot of those jobs they're just gone. It's cheaper to make the goods there. Again, it's scarce resources that have alternative uses. It's better for us to put those things, and we are. That's the thing. If you look at the service economy, the America is actually doing quite well in terms of that. And Biden, again, is just talking about, as per usual, when he talks about Jim Crow, he's just living in the past. The other thing in that bit, I didn't play it for you, I could have, that Obama talked about that was pretty interesting is, one of the problems you have is if you raise wages to a certain point, right? If you raise them to a certain point, then people will just automize. And, if automation comes in and takes your job, they're not coming back. Earlier in that bit I played, and I didn't play this part of it, I could have. Earlier in that bit, Obama talked about the fact that, say, for example, Ford, he'd gone and visited a Ford plant, and they were making just as many cars with 10% of the workforce because the rest of it was being done by the robots. So that's just the reality of the situation there. So anyway, we're going to come back to Biden's State of the Union a little bit later in the show, but you basically didn't miss a whole lot of anything if you did miss the speech. It was just time and time again things that basically had no basis in reality. And all you need to do is basically go to the White House Chief of Staff, Ron Klain, go to his Twitter feed, and you will get a spoonful of this that you got at the State of the Union. So the other big story of the week was Ukraine, and I have a Daily Mail article here pulled up. And it's a great article. I'd highly recommend it. I'll try to put a description of it in the link if I get around to it when I post this video. But this is, I'm going to give you an update on what's going on in Ukraine. So a lot of things happened last week as it relates to Ukraine. But this Daily Mail article was one that there were a couple of realities that came out if you know where to look in terms of the Ukraine dispute. So the first and foremost you have to understand as it relates to Ukraine that this is an existential threat to the Russians. Ukraine basically is on their doorstep. It's their neighbor. They do not want Ukraine to be part of the EU. They do not want Ukraine to have NATO weapons. Just that simple. And so for them, any sort of, the West meddling in Ukraine, they see as a threat. And they sort of always seen it as a threat. Now, I'm not excusing what Putin has decided to do by going into another country, but you do have to understand that. And so here's a bit that we played on the Daily Show. Take a listen to this. This is an expert from 2014 who is explaining. This is Stephen Cohen, and he's explaining how not just Putin but all Russians look at the Ukraine situation. Take a listen to this.
If we move the forces, NATO forces, including American troops, toward Russia's borders, where will we be then? I mean, it's obviously going to militarize the situation and therefore raise the danger of war. And I think it's important to emphasize, though I regret saying this, Russia will not back off. This is existential. Too much has happened. Putin, and it's not just Putin. We seem to think Putin runs the whole of the universe. He has a political class. That political class has opinions, these negotiations, but he will not back off if confronted militarily. He will.
Now, so the point there that gentleman was making is, and this is something that unfortunately a lot of people in the West are just not acknowledging. Again, it's existential to them. On the Daily Show, we played a couple other bits to make this point. I mean, no one in Russia, not just Putin, no one in Russia looks at the West starting to meddle in Ukraine as anything other than a threat. And when you start talking about NATO or European Union status or bringing weapons or anything like that, it becomes existential. So that's something that a lot of people that are looking at the situation don't seem to understand. I'm not saying what Putin did is okay, but you have to understand that to him it's existential. This is somebody that's right on our doorstep. We can't have that. Another thing that people don't seem to be paying attention to or really acknowledging, especially on the West and the social media that's going on, is that Ukraine only has about 200,000 troops. And Russia has, it looks like, 5 fronts out there that is attacking Ukraine, and they've got about 2 million in reserves. So what I'm going to pull up here, I've pulled up here for you. This is a map from the Daily Mail article that we pulled up and covered on the show this week. And so I want you to look at these 4 fronts that are coming. And the short story here is, unless the West, which so far no one is, not even suggesting it, unless NATO, the United States, or somebody, Germany, Poland, whatever, is willing to come to the aid of Ukraine, they are going to lose this battle. All right, and it's just as simple as looking at this map. So if you look here, Russia has three forces, three fronts. So they got one coming from the south here that you can see right here. They're coming from the south, headed north towards Kyiv. Then you've got another one over here, right over here, heading from the west to the east towards Kyiv. And then you've got another one coming down, right, from the north to the south to Kyiv. And then you've got one more from Belarus coming down and heading towards Kyiv. And that's, again, from an ally of Russia there. And then they've got a fifth front over here where I'm showing you at the bottom right. That's the Donetsk and those regions. That's got Ukrainian soldiers bunched up there. So militarily, if you look at militarily the situation, there is not much that can be done there. And sooner or later, Ukraine is going to have to give up. And I frankly don't understand why the West is spending so much time encouraging Ukraine to hold out, because at the end of the day, unless you're going to give them firepower to defend themselves, they're just not going to be able to hold out. Just a military fact. So I thought that taking a look at the facts was important, and hopefully people will at some point do that. So the other thing that was interesting about the Ukrainian situation, a couple other things before we move on the week, is that you're getting a lot of propaganda that's coming out of Ukraine as well. So a lot of the people, you just get these images and they're talking. And so, for example, I think the foreign minister of Ukraine went and signed up for a membership in the European Union. And I want you to understand that they do not qualify for membership in the European Union. And I'll just tell you how I know that. Anybody should know this. It's been complicated. But a few years ago, I took a trip and went to Eastern Europe. And I went to Austria, I went to Hungary, and I went to the Czech Republic. And Austria was a Soviet satellite until 1955. They were the first to escape, and escaped again about 10 years after the war. They are a first world nation. They are a member of NATO, and they are a member of the European Union, more specifically than NATO. They are a thriving economy, and that was because Russia left after only about 10 years. Hungary and the Czech Republic, however, only became free, and they were no longer, Soviet vassals until after the wall fell. So you're talking, into the 80s and 90s, all right? And when we were there, we were just shocked at how beautiful it was and how gorgeous the infrastructure was and how old these cities are and how these people are just wonderful people. And they're Eastern Europeans. They've been there. I was like, why aren't you in the European Union? And to a person, every one of them, our economy's not big enough. You have to have this size of an economy, and we don't have it. Ukraine's economy is tiny. They can apply to the European Union all they want. And just like Hungary and just like the Czech Republic, which, by the way, have economies that dwarf what Ukraine has, they're not getting in. So all this stuff may make you feel good. Oh, we're going to let them into the European Union, but we're not. And NATO's not going to let them in either. I can tell you Putin has said this several times, and a lot of, if you look at real true scholars on this, have said that NATO is not going to let them in. They're not going to escalate this. Putin has said time and time again, and all of the people, the experts agree, NATO getting in there and helping, actually putting boots on the ground or planes or whatever is considered an act of war. So too would be a no-fly zone in Ukraine. And so far NATO and everybody, the United States, have all said they're not going to have a no-fly zone. So a couple other things that were out there this past week. I'm not going to do a bit. Maybe next week as we get better. I mean, this is a new experience for me, so we're trying to keep it as simple as possible for our first live stream. But a couple other things out there. There was a story, again, just it seems like it was propaganda. They say that the Russians were bombing the biggest nuclear plant in Europe, and that if it went up in flames, it would be 10 times worse than Chernobyl. Now, of course, the next day, it was revealed that the fire got put out, the Russians took the plant, it wasn't a big deal. But this is not something that should be taken lightly. The Ukrainians, again, whether you're cheering for them or not, should not be putting out propaganda about Chernobyl. I mean, they know good and well that's trying to get the international community to come in, but that could provoke the Soviets. And just again, it's also not good long term, because nuclear power is something that is incredibly beneficial for society, and we really don't need people to be scared of it. And these things are safe. They have fail-safe after fail-safe after fail-safe. And there was not going to be any real serious problem there, and they shouldn't have said it. Well, Lindsey Graham went on to Fox News this past week and said that somebody should assassinate Putin. Now, again, folks, we talked about it a lot on the daily podcast. But Putin, again, we don't have to agree with him. We have to understand this is his next-door neighbor. Traditionally, Russia has had a buffer between the West and getting up into its borders. And so only after the Berlin Wall fell in the 80s and the early 90s, as they began to let go of these different formal Soviet satellites, this is a new experience for him. And so you have to understand, he considers NATO encroaching in, the European Union encroaching in, as hostile. What do you think he thinks when you call for him to be assassinated? So I don't know what Lindsey Graham is thinking and saying that, but it was obviously irresponsible, and he really needs to move on. But anyway, those are the facts where it stands on Ukraine. So far, the Ukrainians have been able to hold out. As I'm, obviously live streaming here on Sunday, the Russians have not quite taken the whole place, but they are eventually going to at some point. It's just a question of what the cost is. And before we leave and go to another topic, it's important to understand a lot of these ramifications that are going on. There are unintended consequences of the West, making this into sort of a social media war. So one of them is everybody was celebrating yesterday when Visa and MasterCard and a bunch of other institutions cut off the Russians from the credit card system. Well, they just bounced over and got on China's credit card system, and all we're doing is pushing them to China and threatening the superiority of the U.S. dollar. So people might want to rethink this sort of strategy of people who are, everybody becomes a foreign policy expert. So one of the other highlights of the week was Biden continuing to talk about the oil prices. He mentioned it, the fact that he felt our pain when he was talking at the State of the Union. Well, he sent out his energy secretary, Granholm, to say this about what she thought she was going to do about the energy policies and where we were. So take a listen to the energy secretary under Biden and what she has to say about this.
But the bottom line is that this president and this administration are looking at every single tool to shield American families from the impact of rising energy prices. And we're working through an energy transition. And we've got to start by adding energy. And the reality is we have to take some time to get off of oil and gas. We recognize this. This is a transition. But what's going on there is pretty simply what's going on there is part of the problem with energy prices are rising, right, has, a lot to do with a lot of different things. But the essential reason that they're rising, just why everything else is rising, there's two problems. First and foremost, the Biden administration, and just to be fair, folks, at the Great American Mail, we believe in being fair. But partially this was Trump's fault too, because he pumped a lot of money into the system when COVID hit. And so you've got too many dollars chasing too few goods. So that's always going to hike the price of everything. And part of the problem, the way we're doing it now. So in the old days, what we would do is we would go and we would tax and we'd take money from certain people and then we would give it to other people, right? So we weren't increasing the supply of money. We were just transferring money around. Then we did a similar thing when we would sell bonds and we get people to buy these bonds. And then we would take the money that we took from people via a bond, and then again we would use it to spend on things. Well, lately we've just started printing money, so that's just brand new money out of nothing. In the old system with the taxes and the bonds, you were taking money from the system and transferring it to another. Well, when you just increase the money supply, right, just like a rising tide lifts all boats, more money makes everything more expensive because people have more money to spend on things, and when people do that, they can raise prices. As it relates to energy, however, that is one of the biggest problems is by the Biden administration, they want us to transition over to green energy. You just heard Secretary Granholm say that. We're transitioning, right? We're going to electric. Now, I would prefer, honesty to, or clarity to agreement. You don't need to agree, but just tell the people what we're doing. We're transitioning to turbines and we're transitioning to solar panels. And as a result of that, we're not drilling for more oil. We're not going to let the leases that we have expired. We're not going to build the Keystone Pipeline, etc. Now, that means there's going to be a lower supply of oil. And if there's a lower supply of oil, then that means, again, scarcity. It's going to go up. So I wish Granholm would have been more honest about that. But listen, this is something since I went to law school in the 90s, they've been talking about, and they've said this all along, is that alternative green energy, part of the problem it has is it can't compete with oil because oil is A, cheaper, and then B, you've already got the infrastructure. You've always got the gas stations. You've already got all these different ways to transport it. Everybody has a car that burns on gas. Most people don't have a car that you can just plug in. So they are trying to, accelerate the transition. And the thing is, they just need to be honest about it. So Granholm there at least is sort of acknowledging it, and hopefully they'll continue to acknowledge it. So another big story this past week was the jobs report came out, and we'll let Chuck Schumer. Here's Chuck Schumer explaining the jobs report from last week. Take a listen.
In the coming months and beyond, Senate Democrats will maintain a focus on one of the most vexing issues facing American families, lowering costs while building on the wage and job growth we've seen over the past year. The American economy is booming compared to a year ago. The number of new jobs added to the economy is staggering. We've added more than 6 million new jobs in a single year, including the most new manufacturing jobs in decades. But at the same time, we must fiercely confront the wave of rising costs.
Now, what's going on there is we all know. So we have not gotten back to the number of jobs that existed before COVID hit and we shut down. And that's just a reality. Now, there are some new jobs being created, but it's very difficult, and they don't do this. They don't break down brand new jobs versus jobs that existed that have just come back because we're reopening, right? So when Biden talks about creating more jobs or having the greatest GDP of any president in history, it's just, I'm not going to say it's a lie because I don't know what's in his mind, and a lie is an intent to deceive. But clearly at this point, we're just getting jobs that are coming back, and we're spending money. When you write $3 trillion, the government spending actually goes into the gross domestic product. So when you spend that kind of money, then the president's going to have a high gross domestic product. But what's shameless is people like Schumer and them are continuing to take credit for these jobs as if our economy is really booming. And so, again, if you don't understand what the problem is, it's very difficult to get very far. One other thing that was interesting there in that Schumer bit, he talked about manufacturing jobs being created. Again, if that's being created, they're being created falsely, because manufacturing is just, again, you heard Obama, don't take my word for it. It's something that you just can't wave a magic wand and come in. And if it is happening, then they're doing it falsely. And so we're going to end up paying with our tax money for them to have jobs subsidized so that they'll basically support the Democrat Party. So another big story this past week was Ron DeSantis. We covered it on the show at the time and said it was a gaffe. We're going to cover it a little bit in detail here. Maybe you don't agree it's a gaffe, but unfortunately, and we say this all the time, I mean, there is a double standard. It's unfortunate. It shouldn't be a double standard. But anyway, here's Ron DeSantis speaking at USF, and here's what he had to say as it relates to masks.
You do not have to wear those masks. I mean, please take them off. Honestly, it's not doing anything, and we got to stop with this COVID theater. So if you want to wear it, fine, but this is ridiculous.
So, you can hear him sigh there. And again, folks, I'm sorry to say this, but reality, we believe in being honest. Look, there is a double standard. If that had been a Democrat, it would not have made news. The fact that it was a Republican, it was everywhere. I think midweek, it was all anybody was talking about. And it's unfortunate, but there is a double standard. And I'm not criticizing DeSantis. We love DeSantis. I mean, I went to Florida State, huge fan of Florida. I lived down there for several years, even when I wasn't in law school. So I love DeSantis. I love Florida, but that just is an unforced error, and you have to be careful. And you just got to be careful of the tone. I think he could have come in there and just said, "You young folks, if you don't want to, you don't have to wear those masks. Don't do it for me. Don't do it for theater." I just think the tone could have been better. And of course, you probably saw one of the children that was there, his mother later went on one of the shows and literally said that she was angry that her son got told that he didn't need to wear a mask, and that it just became a huge deal where now all of a sudden Republicans don't let parents choose and all that. So it was just bad. As it relates to masks, one of the people we follow at the Great American Mail, I follow a lot of different people I'm a libertarian. And I despise the way the left has taken over the Democrat Party. So we spend a lot of time, criticizing them. But I still believe it's important to read everybody. And so one of the persons I follow on Twitter is a guy named Elie Mistel. You can see him here. And so he had a tweet that kind of went viral. This was after the State of the Union address. And it read, "Here's my 9-year-old's analysis, again, of Biden's speech. I agree with almost everything President Biden said, except for the part about not wearing masks in places like schools. I think maybe President Biden doesn't understand how easy it is to wear a mask." Now, the tweet ended up going viral, And he, of course, made it into a racial thing because he happens to be black. And for a guy like Elie Mystal, everything is black. But the important thing to understand about that tweet, which was interesting, is, and the left does this all the time, why would we talk to our 9-year-olds about the State of the Union address and about policy and about what a grown person understands about masks? I have no idea, but that's the left for you. I mean, they really do think, that we should be getting our environmental advice from the Greta Thunbergs of the world. But anyway, so that was part of the tweet that was interesting. The other part of it was they're just not going to let it go. He tweeted later in the week he was going back to a studio for the first time and tweeted something like going back to a studio for the first time in years, and he was fully masked. He looked like Darth Vader. I mean, it was unbelievable. And so I don't know that we're going to be able to move on. I mean, again, we played Biden's, State of the Union. It's time to treat each other as Americans and put this COVID thing behind us, but it doesn't look like he's going to be able to do it. So another big story, this actually technically happened Friday of last week, but another big story of the past week was on last Friday, right? Again, it came out after we had done the podcast, so we included it on the weekly. The COVID formula that the CDC had been using to determine whether you were in a red or green or really hazardous area was changed just like that. And right before the State of the Union, I'm sure it's a coincidence. I'm sure it is a coincidence. They are following the science over there. Don't think that they're not following the science. It was completely scientific that on Friday before the State of the Union on Tuesday, all of a sudden the CDC changed the risk formula so that 90% of the country that had been in the red zone, right, in supreme danger of COVID, all of a sudden now only 30%. So if you take a look there, you can see the 90% before the State of the Union and then 30% by the time the State of the Union was given, they had changed it. And again, I'm sure it's a coincidence. I have every faith that President Biden in no way would President Biden ever direct the CDC to change its formula. I'm sure it was all the science. So the week started off, interestingly enough, and again, this was the Saturday, again, before the week started, but it again made it into the mainstream of the political environment midweek. This was a bit from Saturday Night Live. Take a listen to this. And again, it's a good sign that they're starting to mock the people who won't let COVID go. But there's also a little bit of, if you listen to this, maybe we're not going to be able to get there as fast as we could. Anyway, here's Saturday Night Live describing a few couples out to dinner discussing COVID. Take a listen.
I'm so glad we're doing this. My favorite restaurant with my favorite people.
Honey, I agree 100%.
You know what? This is so fun. Dinner is on us.
Oh, wow. But, Keith, you can take your mask off at the table.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know I'm wearing it half the time.
Well, I heard the CDC is going to lift all mask mandates soon.
Oh, yeah, I know.
It's so weird. It's like COVID's not over, but it's just going to stop. I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah. Oh, that reminds me of this article I read.
Oh, honey, no one wants to hear about that.
Well, it was in Bloomberg, and I thought it was interesting.
What article?
Well,
Honey.
It was just saying how mask mandates had, I don't know, little to no effect on COVID. Anti-mask or anything. I just sometimes wonder if any of the things we did actually helped.
Gina.
No. We can talk about this incredibly complicated and emotional topic.
Yes, of course. I will start because, for instance, while I am so personally relieved that I'm vaccinated.
Careful.
I sometimes wonder if other people who are hesitant, careful, might not have like a valid.
What?
Not valid, but understandable.
Not tonight.
Help me.
I think what she means is maybe sometimes we are a little overzealous when we condemn.
Oh, no.
I just think that if people are actually losing their jobs.
Oh.
Okay, so those were the bites that we had. Anyway, you can get that out there if you want, and you want to get more of that and finish. It was actually pretty amusing. So we'll see. I mean, right now, the news that's going on, it looks like Biden wants to move on. The election season is hit. He's gotten the CDC to say the mask guidance is being dropped everywhere. We'll see where it goes. It'll be interesting, but it looks like there are a lot of people on the Democrat side that don't want to let it go, and so we'll see what happens. A couple other stories I wanted to give to you just so you're up to speed, and again, hopefully we'll get this process hammered out and improve as we go forward. But there was a couple other things that happened last week you need to know about. The first was the January 6th committee filed a pleading in a case that's been filed by John Eastman. John Eastman was one of the lawyers that was one of the architects of Trump's challenge of the certification process on January 6th. So again, we've talked about it on our Substack page. If you want to go to there, GreatAmericanMail.substack.com, GreatAmericanMail.substack.com. Don't do HTTP or whatever, just www.GreatAmericanMail.substack.com. We've got 2 articles up there on the January 6th issue. And so the long and the short of it basically is that there is the Electoral Act of 1887 provides that at the certification process, there is an objection process that can come forward. And if there's an objection to seating certain states, then that objection each chamber, the House and the Senate separately have to go back and debate the objection. You have to have 1 congressperson and 1 senator. Trump had about 8 senators. He had about 100 congresspeople ready to object. 7 states had sent alternate electors. So there was going to be a possibility of that going forward. And of course, you all know about Mike Pence potentially being able to say, well, I potentially, as the presiding officer, can decide whether or not we need to delay this or whether or not these people need to be sent back to their respective states. So anyway, as a result of the rally getting out of control, all of that process went away, never happened. But John Eastman is suing the January 6th committee because they're trying to, basically it's a witch hunt, they're coming after him, and he's claimed attorney-client privilege. Now, for whatever reason he claimed attorney-client privilege, he filed a motion with the court. And then the January 6th committee, headed by Penny Thompson, filed a reply. I've got the reply in my hand right here. It's 61 pages, and I can tell you as a practicing attorney, in order to file 61 pages, you have to seek motion from leave for court to do it. They did that, but here's all you really need to know that it's a hoax. So I'm reading from this is again from the defendants from the January 6th committee's response. When the Electoral College met on December 14, 2020, and confirmed the certified results of the election, the results of the election should have been final. Now, what they're talking about there is before January 6th, where you actually open the ballots, on December 14th, you have basically a pre-run through and you figure out that's the deadline for the states to say, here's how these electors are going to go. Well, I want you to listen to this again. When the Electoral College met on December 14th, 2020, and confirmed the certified results of the election, the results of the election should have been final. Well, if that's the case, then why do you need a January 6th? I mean, you don't even need to be a lawyer to know that, and we are. But plaintiff advised President Trump to press an unconstitutional plan to disregard those results on January 6th. The text of the 12th Amendment to the Constitution clearly describes Congress's obligation to count certified electoral votes. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates and votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of the votes for president shall be president. Nothing in the Constitution permits Congress or the presiding officer to refuse to count certified electoral votes in this context, yet that is precisely what plaintiff suggested. Plaintiff, again, is John Eastman, one of Trump's lawyers. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that's certainly not the way Congress has interpreted this in the past, because the Electoral Count Act of 1887 describes an entire procedure whereby you absolutely do not have to count votes. Again, if you want to go to our Substack page, GreatAmericanMail.substack.com, you can. We'll try to, again, put a link in the description, and you can check that article out. But if you do, you will see there is a process. And just so you know, we're not trying to be partisan here. In 2004, Barbara Boxer, and I can't remember the name of the California delegate. They objected to the certification of the results of the Ohio electors. And as you know, that was such a close election. If George W. Bush doesn't win Ohio, he doesn't win the election. Well, the president at the time presiding over it was Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney did what the Electoral Count Act of 1887 presides. You each had to retire to the House and to the Senate. 2 hours of debate, came back. They rejected the challenge, and those electors were certified. But again, the January 6th committee is making a mountain out of a molehill about this stuff. So the last thing I wanted to finish with was, it used to be that these State of the Union addresses would be for presidents to come forward and say what they actually believed and, sort of try to galvanize the nation behind their dream or their vision for America. And it's unfortunate that that is no longer the case. And so Biden really, if he was really wanting to do it, he should have really come out and said that, in a Biden administration, we prefer to favor one color of people over another. So we don't believe in the idea of, Dr. King. We, in fact, do judge people not by the content of their character, but by the color of their skin. For example, we have nominated someone to the Supreme Court that we said at the outset that only black women need apply. In addition, in the Biden administration, we no longer believe in the use of fossil fuels. We will no longer drill. We will no longer renew. We will not do any more pipelines. We will do everything we can to keep oil and energy from being discovered and brought to the market in America. Anyway, you get the idea. I mean, he could have gone on and on and on. I mean, he could have said, in America, we don't believe in trial by jury or speedy trials or bails, or that you get to see all the evidence against you and face your accusers if you are somebody that we deem a political opponent, like the January 6th defendants, right? In the Biden administration, we no longer believe in a separation of powers. We are just fine with the January 6th committee taking over what are executive functions and in some instances taking over what are judicial functions. I mean, he should have done that. It would have been a better speech had he done that. But anyway, what he basically tried to do was go and see if he could fool the American people. And so we will see how it goes. I hope you like this. If you did, please subscribe and share this with other people. Again, we're going to be doing this live stream every week. We usually do it on Saturday. I had to do it on Sunday today because, frankly, it took me a while to figure out how to get YouTube to go live and all that. So we're going to work on it. Maybe we'll get the audio, see it once we hear back from you folks, see how it is, and try to sue it. But again, if you like this, please subscribe. That'll help us out a lot. And I'll try to put links to some of the things that we talked about here and put links to our daily podcast if you want to listen to that. So again, we look forward to seeing you next time.